Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the fourth part of a series introducing Catholic social thought through the document Rerum Novarum, published in 1891. The document Rerum Novarum begins, "The spirit of revolutionary change, which has long disturbed the nations of the world, has passed from politics to economic life." And what this series does is try to understand the document in the light of these revolutionary changes as perceived by Leo XIII. So the first two parts of this series discuss the events and theoretical changes from the 1300s to the 1800s that lead to the publication of Rerum Novarum in 1891. We begin, as always, with the great Catholic synthesis achieved by Thomas Aquinas with his Summa Theologica and Dante with his Divine Comedy that provided this vision of the world through Catholic eyes. And we looked at the events that worked against this synthesis from really from the 1100s on to the 1800s, and the theoretical changes that occurred over the same time period that brought the dominance of the Catholic Church back and really undermined that dominance. In the third part of the series, we discussed the document itself, Rerum Novarum, focusing on it as the beginning of this tradition of Catholic social thought and looking at it as providing this middle way between the rise of classical liberalism and socialism in its primary ideas of common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. In this final discussion, we want to look at the legacy of the document Rerum Novarum. Immediate reactions in the 1890s were mixed, of course, and you could probably imagine how they're mixed. So liberals and moderates. So here, when we're talking about liberals, we're not talking about, of course, classical liberals. We're talking about a branch of classical liberals, which we would normally call Democrats or a Labor Party. And moderates found the document promising and said that it was a starting point. Socialists, of course, said it didn't go far enough in terms of protecting workers and undermining capitalism. And conservatives, who again belonged to the tradition of classical liberalism, said it leaned too far to the worker. So Leo XIII managed to upset quite a bunch of people, and we can still see those divisions among Catholics and among political theorists today in terms of the legacy of Catholic social thought and the advances that it's made. In France, it turned out that workers formed study groups to ask if Christianity could help support their struggles. This was not alone in France. We'll see that more in the 1950s, 60s, and later in South America, where it becomes dominant, and in Africa and other places where the hard work that supports our capitalistic lifestyles has been shrugged off on those least in power. Americans, however, think that Leo XIII is too much like Karl Marx, and we see that throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, that anytime a document on Catholic social thought is published, Americans tend to think that it is too socialist and reject its teachings. Now here, of course, I'm talking about United States Americans, so we're not talking about Canadians or South America as much. And that says a lot about Catholics in America and their association with very conservative tendencies within the Catholic Church and their embrace of both classical liberalism and capitalism and their rejection of various principles of not only Catholic social thought, but of the tradition of the Catholic intellectual tradition from Thomas Aquinas forward. The central contributions of Rerum Novarum is to move the church from the right to a center. So we saw that move in terms of the switch from Pius IX to Leo XIII. Pius IX fully closing off the Catholic Church from the modern world, and Leo XIII opening up to have an engagement with the modern world. So not accepting the modern world, but challenging it through traditional Catholic principles. Donald Dora, again, the author of Option for the Poor, a fantastic book on Catholic social thought, says that Leo XIII challenged the idea that capitalist laws are laws of nature. Certainly, we see that that idea that capitalist laws are laws of nature in economic theory today, but going back as far as, of course, Adam Smith, who saw it as a law of nature. And so Leo XIII challenges this, and this is something that Catholic social thought continues to do over and over, and that goes back to the ideas of property in St. Thomas Aquinas, which of course he adopted from Aristotle. It defends, of course, the right of the workers and says that labor cannot be treated as a commodity. So this idea of the dignity of the worker becomes central. And it caused each class to meet its obligations. And we saw that in our discussion of the document. So that capitalists have rights, but they also have duties to workers, and workers have rights and they have duties as well. Everyone is called to work, of course. And it's very interesting how this plays out in Leo XIII's embrace of unions, but his claim that unions cannot strike. And one of the things that he's worried about is that strikes inevitably, according to him, mean that there's a destruction of property, and so we cannot destroy that property. I think he misunderstands what a strike does and the purpose of a strike, and he certainly misunderstands the value of the strike in terms of protecting workers and receiving a just wage. And then finally, it presupposes that the rich will use not only will not use their political power to suppress workers. And of course, what we've seen over and over again in the last 150 years is that use of political power to suppress workers in terms of getting rid of unions, preventing unions from being formed, denying just wages, and even preventing a raise in minimum wage. Of course, also using immigrants in ways that keep wages lower, etc., etc. This is the beginning of Catholic social thought, and again, we want to recognize that when I say that this is the beginning of Catholic social thought, what I mean is that this is a beginning of engaging the modern world with principles that are deep-rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And so we can find these principles of common good, of subsidiarity, and of solidarity in Thomas Aquinas, right? One of the great synthesizers, but all the way back into the Catholic intellectual tradition. So when we say that this is the beginning, what we mean is that it provides a moral guide to resist laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. So this is the middle way that the church has tried to find in the modern world. It does embrace a top-down reform model. So the emphasis is on getting states and capitalists to reform the way that they work and to honor their obligations to the poor. And we also find that it is actually more acceptable in Europe than it is in America, even though the United States is much more identifying as a religious group than we see in Europe itself. It is the first of many encyclicals written on the social question, the question of equality and freedom. We see that there's a 40-year gap between the Rerum Novarum and the next one on the 40th year. and then there's a spate of some in the 60s, and then again with John Paul II. Of these documents, the most important, in my opinion, are Popular and Progressio, which is written as a response both to post-colonialism and to the rise of liberation theology. And then Liborum Exercens in 1981, John Paul II's first of many encyclicals, and written, or at least revised, in light of the strike in Poland against the Soviet Union. That becomes very influential, and this is one of the documents that is credited with bringing about the final fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. And then finally, the document Laudato Si by Pope Francis. And the reason this is striking is twofold. First, because it takes a full acknowledgement of the destruction to the environment by industrialism and capitalism. And though there are roots of this in many of the documents listed here, Pope Francis takes this as the central concern for the 21st century. And then second, because Francis moves back from an acceptance of capitalism to at least this questioning of capitalism and socialism as possible modes of life. Over the course of these documents in the last 140 years, we see an expansion of Catholic social thought in a variety of ways. More principles are added. So Vatican II adds the principle of dignity of the worker. It also grounds Catholic social thought on ideas of personalism developed by people like Karol Wojtyła, who later becomes John Paul II, and Jacques Maritain. We also see that the tradition evolves out of doctrine into a larger intellectual tradition, so that people in philosophy and politics, as well as theology, are writing on this tradition and expanding the tradition in a variety of ways. We see the development of liberation theology as a response to the cry of the poor, grounded in a reading of the Bible and particularly the gospel as a response to the poor. And then we also see the expanse of the question, the social question, to issues of immigration, war, and racism. Certainly, issues of immigration are prevalent in contemporary discussions of Catholic social thought and provides one of the fire points around which conservative Catholics in the United States reject the Catholic social thought tradition and in many ways reject Pope Francis, as well as some of the teachings of Pope John Paul II. So there have been mixed reactions to the document in both politics and across different regions. But this is the beginning of the social thought tradition with a variety of social encyclicals. It defines a middle way forward, and we see that it expands. I thank you for joining me in this four-part lecture on Rerum Novarum and the origins of Catholic social thought. I hope this has proved interesting for you and informative, and I invite you to view some of my other lectures. Thank you.